Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, like my good friend from Iowa, Senator Grassley, I'm going to come down here. I want to come down to the Senate floor, talk about the National Security Supplemental we are voting on today. Commend the senior senator for Iowa. He's a great U.S. senator. It was a really good speech. I'm going to reinforce some of what he just said on the importance of this bill. But, Mr. President, importantly, the broader context of how we actually got here and where we need to be going in terms of our nation's defense. My view, the current occupant of the White House, President Biden, has gotten a free pass on his numerous, huge national security missteps that have been undermining our nation's security and have forced the Congress of the United States to actually take action. That's the whole point, Mr. President. We're taking action. I'm a supporter of this legislation, but we're doing it because of the failures of the current occupant of the White House. So I'm going to encourage my colleagues, particularly my Republican Senate colleagues, to vote in favor of this bill, but I think it's important to put it in a broader context of what's going on in the world. I've made a couple speeches on this before. I'm just going to reiterate some and add to some of the challenges we're facing because of the Biden administration. First, Mr. President, I think it's pretty obvious to everybody, anyone who's watching, we're in a new era of authoritarian aggression led by this dictator. That's Xi Jinping. Look at him. He gets in his camis every now and then, threatening his neighbors. By the way, China is going through the largest peacetime military buildup in the history of the world. That doesn't make you a little nervous about what's going on in the world? It should. This guy is a brutal dictator, but it's led by him, Putin, the Ayatollahs in Iran, the terrorists in Iran, largest state sponsor of terrorism, the mini-me dictator, the North Korean dictator. They're all working together, Mr. President. They want to undermine our interests. They want to undermine the interest of our allies. They're driven by historical grievances. They're paranoid about their democratic neighbors. They are more than willing to invade them, as we're seeing across the world, whether Israel, whether Ukraine. And again, they're working together and they are spending boatloads of money on national security issues, military buildups. It's actually led by this guy. He's the big one that we got to keep a close eye on. So that's number one. We're in a real dangerous era. This is one thing I do agree with the Biden administration on. We've had the Secretary of Defense, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs coming in saying, hey, we are in the most dangerous time since probably the end of World War II. Okay, dictators are on the march. They're invading their neighbors. They're massively building up their military, and they're all working together. Sounds a little bit like the 1930s to me. The second reason, Mr. President, we need a defense industrial base supplemental is our own industrial base, our ability to produce weapons for us, for America, has completely atrophied. I could give a speech for hours. And this, again, is part of the Biden administration's fault, but we can't build Navy ships. We can't build Navy subs. Every component of our industrial base is shrinking, it's brittle, it's atrophied, and yet we're in this dangerous period. So that's pretty alarming. By the way, Mr. President, it's our responsibility, Article 1 of the U.S. Constitution, the Senate, the House, to raise an army, to provide and maintain a Navy. In my view, it's the number one constitutional duty we have, securing this nation, and yet we are behind. The Navy just put out 3 weeks ago this alarming report saying the U.S. Navy is behind on every ship platform that they are building, 3 to 5 years behind. Carriers, subs. Almost 40% of our attack sub fleet is in maintenance, not even out to sea. He's scared to death of U.S. subs. What's this guy doing? He's cranking out 10 to 12 ships, high-end Navy ships a year. The Chinese Communist Party's Navy is now bigger than the U.S. Navy. Danger, and our industrial base can't produce weapons the way it could. And then, Mr. President, the third reason I think we need a national security supplemental is given how weak the Biden administration has been on national security. The current budget of this president shrinks the Army, shrinks the Navy, shrinks the Marine Corps. You think Xi Jinping's impressed by that? He's not. Neither is Putin. Neither are the Ayatollahs. That's what they're doing. By the way, this president, every budget he submits to Congress for the military during these real dangerous times, what does he do? He cuts it. Cuts the military. I'm going to get more to that, Mr. President. So these are the big three reasons that I've been supportive of this bill. But here's the thing, Mr. President. When you read the bill and look at it and dig into the details, it's less of a foreign aid bill and much more of a bill to enhance our industrial capacity. It's not a perfect bill. I'm going to get into that in a minute. There's no such thing as a perfect bill, by the way. But almost 60% of this national security supplemental bill that we're going to be voting on goes directly into our industrial base, directly into our ability to build submarines. By the way, it unlocks $6 billion for submarines. $6 billion with the AUKUS agreement. $5 billion for 150 millimeter artillery shells, over $500 million for counter UAS systems, Patriots, Javelins, Harpoons, Tomahawks, HARM missiles, TOW missiles, built by Americans for our own defense. That's in this bill. It's in the bill, Mr. President. So that's a really important component. Almost 60% of this bill goes into that. And it has other things in it, $3 billion for our troops in the CENTCOM area of responsibility right now who are in combat, right now taking incoming missiles from the Houthis. USS Carney almost took 100 different missiles and drones, sailors in combat. This replenishes their weapon systems, helps our troops in combat. By the way, my view, just that element alone is enough to support this bill. You got American troops in combat in the Middle East. And of course, this bill does go to help our allies and partners, Israel, Taiwan, Ukraine, who are facing existential threats, literally, from their very aggressive neighbors. But again, Mr. President, a lot of this is going to stay home. We're not sending subs to any of those countries. We're building submarines to be ready if we have to in a conflict with China. Xi Jinping, that dictator I was just showing you there, he's scared to death of the nuclear sub capability of the United States. So this is mostly about us protecting our country in our industrial base to produce weapons for America. Yeah, I think it's going to put a lot of workers to work, but this bill primarily, if you read it, is about protecting our nation. Now, as I said, Mr. President, it's not a perfect bill. There's a number of things. I had some amendments. We were debating it a couple months ago here in the Senate floor. For example, I think the direct budget support, the economic aid, that should go to our European allies to help the Ukrainians with that. That should go to the Gulf Arab allies who want to support Gaza in terms of economic aid. We should be providing the lethal aid. But I will say, Mr. President, Speaker Johnson definitely improved the bill. From what the Senate sent over a couple months ago, I applaud him for his impressive leadership. There's a number of improvements. The direct budget support and economic aid is now in the form of forgivable loans. That was a President Trump idea. I think it's a good idea. The Repo Act, Senator Risch has been pushing on that hard. He's done a great job on that. That would enable us to take seized Russian assets and help to use to pay for the Ukraine war. There's a requirement that makes the Biden administration lay out a much more detailed strategy on Ukraine, forces them to provide Ukrainians attack and weapon systems, focuses on fentanyl, focuses on TikTok, the improvements there, breaking the tie between the Chinese Communist Party and control of this popular app. The House did try to take up some border security issues, Mr. President. I certainly wish those would have passed. Not sure my Senate Democratic colleagues would have voted on them, but that would have made it better. But many improvements. So the Speaker did a good job on that. But, Mr. President, we've had some critiques on the left and on the right of this bill. I want to just address a few of those, Mr. President, as we're getting ready to vote on this. Some are quite serious. Some of my Republican colleagues have said, hey, the Europeans need to do more, particularly when it comes to Ukraine. I actually agree with that, Mr. President. As a matter of fact, no one in this chamber has worked harder on the issue of making sure our NATO allies meet their 2% obligation in terms of defense spending. I had an amendment to the Sweden and Finland accession treaties that we voted on here that said it's a sense of the Senate that all of these countries have to meet their 2% of GDP obligation on defense as a NATO member. That passed 98-0 here in the Senate. I had an NDAA provision that's now law that says the Secretary of Defense shall prioritize training and troop deployments for countries in NATO with U.S. forces that meet their 2% obligation. So, I agree with those critiques, but some of the critiques from some of my colleagues, Mr. President, let's just say they weren't serious. Might remember one, that this national security supplemental was some kind of secret trap for a future impeachment of President Trump. I'm pretty sure that's not what Speaker Johnson was working on the last 2 months. That this national security bill will, quote, strain our industrial base. Actually, it'll do the opposite. I think that's clear. It's going to make generational investments in our industrial base that hopefully will continue for years. They will continue for years. That the national security supplemental sends, quote, the wrong signal to what the warfighter in America needs for actual threats we face. Well, I find that really curious, Mr. President. Let me give you one example. I worked directly with the Indo-PACOM commander, Admiral Aquilino, on exactly what he thought he needed for America and our forces to help defend Taiwan and the Taiwan Strait. That's in the bill. The original bill from the Biden administration had very little on that. We made it a lot better, a lot stronger. But working directly with Indo-PACOM and the Admiral, there's no better expert in the world on what they need to fight in the Taiwan Strait. So again, that criticism seemed really off base, not a serious critique if you actually are one of the senators doing the homework on what our warfighters need. But, Mr. President, the biggest issue I have with some of the arguments and critiques of this national security supplemental that's actually coming from the left and the right in the House and in the Senate is their claim that deterrence is divisible. Deterrence is divisible. Now, what do I mean by that? Their argument, and I've heard it a lot, is that you can cut off aid to Ukraine, let Putin roll over that country, move up to the borders of the Baltics and Poland, NATO allies, by the way, but somehow we can still be strong in the Taiwan Strait with regard to Xi Jinping and the Ayatollahs in Iran. So deterrence is divisible. You can kind of show weakness with regard to Putin, but strength with regard to Xi Jinping and the Ayatollahs. Well, Mr. President, that's not how the world works. Deterrence is not divisible. How do we know that? Well, I think we know that because of this debacle. Joe Biden's failed approach to national security has shown us that deterrence is not divisible. What am I talking about? When this happened, the botched Afghanistan withdrawal, Biden's debacle, as the economists put it on their front cover, many predicted, many in this chamber, Democrats and Republicans, by the way, myself included, predicted that given this botched Afghanistan withdrawal, dictators around the world are going to be emboldened to press us other places. Stand by. Putin, Xi are going to invade somewhere else because of this. And Mr. President, I didn't only hear that from people here. I've talked to world leaders who said there's no way Putin would have invaded Ukraine if it hadn't been for this Biden debacle. So deterrence is not divisible, Mr. President, and that's Exhibit A. Which brings me to my final point here. The press, our friends in the media, as usual, are missing the bigger story on what's going on this national security supplemental. All the focus has been on the House and how Republicans in the House have delayed the Senate bill for 2 months. That we Republicans in the Congress are not taking foreign policy seriously. But, Mr. President, this bill's passage, in that this bill's passage is some kind of victory for President Biden's foreign policy leadership. But here's what I think is going on, Mr. President. This national security supplemental bill actually exposes even further the weakness of the Biden administration's approach to Ukraine on foreign policy that has only brought the world chaos. I was on a Sunday talk show the other day and made the point, a very simple question: is the world a safer place for America and its allies today relative to 4 years ago? I think everybody knows the answer is no. It's not even close. There's chaos all over the world. And I think what's really important is to focus on how we actually got to this point, why we need this defense supplemental in the first place. And the reason we do is the failure of the current occupant of the White House's policies with regard to foreign policy and national security. That is the entire reason we have to bring this bill, this national security bill, to the floor, and why it is so urgently needed now. This bill is not some kind of exhibit of Joe Biden's foreign policy triumph. It's a needed correction of Joe Biden's foreign policy failure. First, as I've noted, Mr. President, the Afghan debacle certainly emboldened Putin to invade Ukraine. I think that's a view that's commonly held. Secondly, our own border debacle has been something that has made it so Republicans who would normally support strong national security were, with a lot of good reason, saying, hey, let's take care of our own open borders and national security at the southern border first. The President has not done that. We have an open border that is a humanitarian and a national security fiasco in America. Third, Mr. President, this president, with regard to Ukraine, has not been in it to win it. What do I mean by that? Every major weapon system that the Ukrainians have said they need, they have delayed and delayed and delayed because they were fearful of Putin. Let's just call it like it is. The list is long: HIMARS, Stingers, Javelins, tanks, Abrams tanks, F-16s, even the ATACMS that are in the House bill, forcing the president to say we're going to get these really important long-range accurate artillery to the Ukrainians. This is the number one issue we heard from President Zelensky a couple months ago when we were in Munich, that they're just not getting weapons that they need. Imagine if the Biden administration had gotten all those weapon systems I just mentioned to the Ukrainians a year and a half ago. And what has happened every time? This body, Democrats and Republicans, have gone to the president and say, Mr. President, get him these weapons. Well, we're going to delay. We don't want to escalate with Putin. He invaded a country. They're not in it to win it. The president called out an LNG pause on our allies. Our allies in Europe are apoplectic about that, not in it to win it. And finally, Mr. President, this president has never explained the stakes of why this is so important. He's given 2 speeches on Ukraine, 2 major speeches, and you know what he does? He attacks Republicans in his speeches. That's not leadership. That's not leadership. Especially on a big national security issue, you want to bring people together, explain the stakes. Speaker Johnson has done more to explain the stakes in a calm, reassuring manner in the last 2 weeks than President Biden has done in 3 years. And then, Mr. President, finally, again, in terms of lack of seriousness on national security issues, I think the most damning issue is the lack of seriousness with regard to our national defense. As I mentioned, President puts forward budgets to cut defense spending every year. I've asked the Secretary of Defense, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, 3 hearings in a row in the Armed Services Committee. If this is the most dangerous time since World War II, why are you cutting defense spending? Why are you going to bring defense spending in America next year to below 3% of GDP? We've only been there 4 times in the last, since World War II. Why are you dramatically undermining readiness? They don't want to do that. The Secretary of Defense doesn't want to do that. Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, he doesn't want to do that. So why are they doing it? The answer to that, Mr. President, is this is where our Democratic colleagues always are. Since Vietnam, just look at what every president who's a Democrat who's occupied the White House has done. Carter, Clinton, Obama, now Biden. They come in and they cut defense spending and they cut readiness. This is in the DNA of the National Party. Republicans have a different tradition. It's this tradition. Peace through strength. Peace through strength. That's our tradition. To my Republican colleagues and friends in the Senate, our tradition is much more serious. It's prouder, and I will tell you this, it's much more supported by the American people. Peace through strength, not American retreat. So, Mr. President, as I'm encouraging my Republican Senate colleagues to vote on this national security supplemental, this is in line with the peace through strength tradition we have in this party. Think about it. Teddy Roosevelt, Eisenhower, Reagan, of course, the Bush presidencies, and very much in the tradition of peace through strength, the Trump presidency. Mr. President, I was here. Heck, I ran for the U.S. Senate in 2014 primarily because the second term of the Obama administration cut defense spending by 25%. Readiness plummeted. Shocking how badly ready our troops were. When the Trump administration came in, working with Senate Republicans, when we were in majority, we reversed it. Peace through strength. So, Mr. President, through arguments, facts, understanding history, a serious view of the world, peace through strength, my Republican colleagues, we need to keep this tradition going, especially during these dangerous times. We certainly can't rely on our Democratic colleagues to support that. We certainly can't rely on this White House, President Biden, who cuts defense spending every year to support that. And that is a really important reason why I encourage my colleagues to support this national security supplemental. Imperfect bill, yes, but needed during these very dangerous times. I yield the floor.